Welcome to an explainer that literally bridges the deepest inner spaces of the human mind with the farthest physical reaches of outer space. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating synthesis of ideas. We're pulling from the life and writings of Bruce Zen Benefiel. He's a guy who has spent decades exploring the intersections of ufology, psychology, and spirituality. We're going to see how an internal search for truth can actually collide with one of the most profound external mysteries of our time, including a jaw-dropping historical secret from the Apollo lunar missions. All right, let's get right into it. We've got to start by grounding ourselves in Zen's perspective. To really wrap our heads around this material, we need to approach it from a mindful place, viewing ourselves not just as biological machines, right, but as spiritual beings having a human experience. Zen poses this massive, mind-bending question: could we indeed be the condensation of consciousness that manifest in human forms due to planetary protocols? Basically, he's suggesting that a higher cosmic frequency might actually lower itself, condensing into our physical reality based on the specific rules or protocols of living on a planet like Earth. It completely flips the baseline of how we view our existence. He suggests our evolutionary path might actually be about remembering this remarkable process. To grasp why he's asking these kinds of questions, we need to look at the man himself. Zen's early life was completely driven by a deep search for truth. He was adopted young, and that really prompted some profound psychological questions right out of the gate. He was raised by parents who poured unconditional love into him, but they also heavily encouraged his academic and ethical development. That solid foundation fueled a lifelong quest to really understand his own identity and his place in the universe. And that quest, it hit a massive turning point in college. He had a unique near-death experience, or NDE, that completely blew his trajectory wide open. At the time, he was actually on a pre-med track, but the sheer profundity of this spiritual event sent him on an intense internal journey. He totally shifted gears, switched his major to psychology, and eventually became a life coach. He dedicated himself to exploring consciousness and helping people find harmony. He realized pretty quickly that the mysteries he was chasing, well, they definitely weren't going to be found in a standard medical textbook. Now, what's incredibly interesting here is Zen's observation of a huge shift happening within ufology itself. For decades, the whole field has been dominated by what we call nuts and bolts ufology. The endless search for physical craft, mass sightings, military video proof, the hard physical stuff. But Zen advocates for and is actively seeing a shift toward consciousness-based ufology. This approach focuses on internal awareness. It asks us to consider that our connection to non-human intelligence isn't just about spotting ships in the sky. It's actually about harmonic resonance, a shared frequency of consciousness that we are just barely beginning to understand. And this points to a really radical idea. True first contact isn't going to be some sudden Hollywood-style landing on the White House lawn. Instead, it's an evolutionary leap in our conscious awareness. Zen suggests that these non-human intelligences have infinitely creative ways of trying to wake us up from our collective stupor. He believes their presence is largely beneficial, like an indirect intervention meant to help humanity evolve and actually solve our own terrestrial problems by elevating our awareness. To explore these nonlinear realities, Zen didn't just sit back and theorize. He actively put in the work. He personally explored what he calls psycho-spiritual technologies. One of the key methods he used is the multiplane awareness technique. It was originally developed in the 1950s, but Zen was introduced to it in 1989. These are literal techniques used to intentionally bridge that gap between human belief and cosmic reality. By practicing deep, hyper-focused thinking, completely void of distraction, Zen reports experiencing non-local awareness. He's effectively traveling and communicating across different planes of existence using pure thought. Pretty wild, right? So, here is the absolutely crucial question. What happens when someone deeply grounded in that kind of spiritual consciousness actually crosses paths with the hard physical reality of outer space? We've talked a lot about the internal journey, the subjective experiences, the psycho-spiritual tech. But Zen's journey actually put him in the exact same room as the men who piloted the literal nuts and bolts craft of our very own human space program. That brings us to 1997. Zen was managing an event called the Prophets Conference. Because he was running the show, he got to host prominent figures from both consciousness studies and ufology. He facilitated these rare, completely uninterrupted conversations. And it was there that he had a fateful sit-down with someone who had literally walked on the moon, Apollo 14 astronaut Dr. Edgar Mitchell. This wasn't just a quick handshake in a hallway. It was a deep, extensive conversation between two guys who had explored the absolute unknown, just in very different vehicles. Dr. Mitchell shared the profound impact of his journey into space. He described to Zen how watching the Earth rise over the barren lunar horizon just took his breath away. In fact, that specific, overwhelming moment of cosmic perspective is exactly what sparked Mitchell's own deep fascination with human consciousness. It's what led him to launch the Institute of Noetic Sciences as soon as he got back to Earth. Think about that. A man with an immense scientific and military background comes back from the moon, absolutely convinced that consciousness is the ultimate frontier. So as they're trading stories about their spiritual quests, they get into the bigger questions about our place in the universe. Zen opened up about his own near-lifelong engagement with what he perceived as otherworldly intelligences. And Dr. Mitchell's response? He acknowledged that Zen was way more involved in that realm than he was. But then, Mitchell decided to drop a breathtaking historical secret from his own Apollo mission. Mitchell took Zen right back to the physical reality of space, specifically to those super perilous moments during the Apollo 14 mission. He explained that shortly after his lunar excursion module, the LEM, detached from the command module and started its really vulnerable descent toward the moon's surface, something practically impossible happened. Right in the middle of this highly calculated, rigid scientific maneuver, they were met by an unknown presence. Mitchell told Zen that these silver, metallic-looking cylinders began encircling the LEM. They were literally spiraling around the craft as it descended. And he knew immediately they were undoubtedly under direct intelligent control. This wasn't space junk. It wasn't a weird reflection or a trick of the light. These objects were intelligently navigating around a human spacecraft in the dead vacuum of space. And the kicker? Mitchell noted they appear to have originated directly from the surface of the moon itself. Oh, and it wasn't just one stray anomaly. Mitchell estimated there were about a dozen of these silver cylinders, 12 distinct craft. They maintained this perfect spiraling formation around the lunar module, essentially escorting the astronauts during the descent, and they stayed with them until they were just a few hundred feet above the lunar surface. Only then did the objects break off and leave the descending human craft alone. Dr. Mitchell was just completely perplexed. He detailed what we can really only call the lunar enigma. These cylinders demonstrated technology that was vastly superior to anything in human capability back then, or even right now. Mitchell sensed that whoever was operating these craft had been stationed on the moon for an extensive period, maybe thousands or even millions of years. The encounter was so profound, so definitive, that Mitchell actually suspected it was the real reason the Apollo missions eventually stopped. He believed humanity was quietly given the message that, well, we just weren't welcome on the moon anymore. Adding incredible weight to this whole mystery, rumors started surfacing over a decade later regarding the Apollo 11 mission. Stories leaked out that Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong had observed similar silver cylinders, except they saw them standing upright on what looked like a rectangular landing pad near the edge of the dark side of the moon. If that's true, it proves Dr. Mitchell's awe-inspiring and honestly terrifying experience wasn't an isolated incident. The moon, it seems, was already occupied. But here is the real twist. Despite witnessing this massive, undeniable external reality of non-human intelligence, Mitchell's reaction to Zen's stories was incredibly telling. After hearing about Zen's inner journeys and spiritual ascension experiences, Mitchell told him that he found those internal explorations even more fascinating than the physical alien craft he saw in space. For Mitchell, the ultimate mystery wasn't the metal cylinders, it was the spiritual implications. It was how human consciousness might be connected way beyond our physical bodies, and how that consciousness ties us to the rest of the universe. Which leaves us with a really profound thought to wrap up this explainer. We started with Zen Benefiel's premise of consciousness condensing into human form, and we traveled all the way to the moon to hear about silver cylinders spiraling around Apollo astronauts. If the physical proof is indeed already waiting for us up there in the stars, if they've literally been watching us arrive and gently pacing our descent, then maybe the real final frontier isn't outer space at all. If these intelligences are already here, is the human race finally evolving our inner consciousness enough to truly understand them? That is the big question we've got to carry forward. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those bigger questions.